A fully restored Crazy Marine, a never-before-seen licensed Pelican song, and multiple cut sections. This is Halo Combat Evolved Restored, a video series and mod dedicated to analyzing and restoring all the cut content in Halo Combat Evolved. Everything that was left behind in the game's code or hinted at in various media, including beta builds and even commercials. And with the release of the Halo 1749 beta build, we now have access to a whole new variety of cut dialogue, encounters, models, and more that was previously thought unavailable. And so, in the spirit of the spooky month, where the real terror is actually just my tardiness, I decided to revisit and revitalize the most iconic spooky level of them all, 343 Guilty Spark. In the very opening cutscene, the beta played with a lot of interesting concepts, such as, what if instead of Covenant fleeing, we also had Marines fleeing with them? At least that's what I think this is supposed to be. I don't know, it could also be that the Marines are like off-screen Flood, shooting at the Covenant and following them, just the AI doesn't really work like that, so you're just kind of left with whatever this is. This idea of the Marines instead acting as off-screen Flood does have some support by the floating intro assault rifles I covered in the last video, shooting at the Covenant as they run away. Perhaps the Marines were originally going to fit this purpose. But just the same, the Flood is a terrifying new enemy, and we have evidence later in the level of Marines and Jackals forming a makeshift alliance, so it makes sense in this context to instead view the Marines as fleeing alongside the Covenant, just a bit undercooked. I might even go so far as to say, even if this wasn't the original intention, the Marines running with the Covenant like this likely went on to inspire this later scene with the Human Covenant Last Stand. So in this light, this is the approach I took to adapt the 1749 Marines. Now, in addition to all this, Bungie did originally have someone or something firing at the Covenant as they fled out into the open. This was likely cut to build more atmosphere and tension, be less obvious. Keeping to this original vision while still building something coherent eventually led to this final result. The scene opens up to Covenant and a Marine fleeing from something lurking within. And as we cross into the open swamp, you'll see even more chaos with grunts and Marines fleeing in a somewhat disorganized fashion. Then, just as you start to get your bearings, plasma shots ring out from the hills. Then another. And finally, an assault rifle to round out that maybe it's not just Covenant gone rogue here. The goal here was to keep it spooky like the original, but add in these cut ideas in a way that enhances the tension rather than take away from it. Tell the story in a more subtle way, leaving the rest to the player's imagination. But yeah, this opening scene with all the Marines, Covenant, and scenery elements took quite a lot of experimentation to get it just right. Honestly, half the effort was just getting the AI to path correctly. It's all in-game, and small deviations can lead to some funny results sometimes since it all centers around specific commands. You order the AI to do something and they do their best. And the other half was just trying to aim these fucking rifles. Had to do it all manually from afar until they shot in just the right spot. But hey, that's not all there was to this scene. There's also the Lost Away team, a cut chapter title from 1749 that would ultimately be replaced with Well Enough Alone in the final game. Also more interestingly, we have some cut Foehammer dialogue.
The last transmission from the captain's dropship was from this area. That was over 12 hours ago. We've been unable to re-establish contact with the captain or his team. I'll stay in the neighborhood in case the area's hot. When you locate Captain Keyes, radio in, and I'll come pick you up. Good luck, sir.
You'll recognize much of that 1749 dialogue is in the final game, but it was heavily stripped down.
The last transmission from the captain's dropship was from this area. That was over 12 hours ago. When you locate Captain Keyes, radio in, and I'll come pick you up.
In fact, if you open these Foehammer sound files in a tag editor, they confirm this. It's actually the same exact take, having the same length even.
The last transmission from the captain's dropship was from this area.
They just silenced the parts they wanted to cut out. In other words, it's got the length, just not the... What I'm really trying to say here is they likely cut this a lot later in development. Certain timing cues, like when Foehammer takes off, is tied to how long a particular line of dialogue is. So rather than having to completely redo this entire cutscene just to get all the different timings and camera shifts correct again, they just silenced the parts they wanted to cut out. Before moving on, there's one final bit that was also cut from this opening sequence. In the beta build, as Foehammer is landing, assault rifle fire would ring out from the swamp directly at the player. I believe this was meant to give a chaotic feel and force the player to panic and look around for what shot at them. But in the context of the final cutscene revision, it's clear Bungie wanted to go in a very different direction and just build tension the whole way through. Make the player feel uneasy, like something is wrong but you can't quite place it. I reckon if this were to stay, it would exist solely to help build more tension, perhaps happening off screen in a way many people might miss, like the Bigfoot sightings throughout the swamp. Perhaps instead of shooting at the players, these rifles would instead be situated in the hills and fire at Foehammer as she takes off behind the player. It's a lot more subtle, off in the distance distance. Most might miss it or only catch a glimpse, but it would leave an impact. Oh, and let me tell you, aiming these things was just as fun as before, especially when you can't see anything. Oh gosh, it's just so much fun that in keeping with this theme of subtle tension, I also decided to adapt all the other cut floating assault rifles that appear throughout the swamp. You'll recall these happen initially as you move forward, shooting at some fleeing Covenant and also firing at you when you cross the down log. These rifles in their raw state feel very out of place, like this wasn't really what Bungie was going to use them for and were instead planning something else entirely. I'd need to dig a little deeper to figure out just what that purpose might be. Well, as it happens, there is another cut component that perfectly explains what these rifles would have actually been intended for. Within the game's data, there's somewhat unused dead bodies scattered throughout this initial swamp section. I say somewhat unused because in the base game, if you go down into the facility and then come back up, you'll actually see them spawned in. But this was actually due to a scripting error rather than being intentional, which I'll get back to in a second. These bodies would just act as some spooky scenery as you move about the swamp. But if we combine these bodies with the floating rifles, well, the overall idea becomes quite clear. Perhaps these rifles will be part of a small skirmish the player would see off in the distance beyond the fog. And upon moving closer, well, you'd see the aftermath. Essentially, all swamp combat happens away from the player, supporting the notion that the Flood are trying to lure Chief into the facility, viewing him as a high-risk, high-reward target, and want to ambush him in a way that he can't easily escape from. So they're clearing out everything and everyone in sight, except Chief, whom they just track from the hills. This makes perfect sense, tying together two pieces of cut content that work really well in tandem. Before we move on, let's go back to that scripting error I mentioned earlier that accidentally spawns these cut bodies in the base game. Bungie specifically hard-coded this initial swamp section to not contain any of these dead bodies, likely to put more emphasis on the combat encounters they ultimately went with. The problem is, if you go down into the facility, then come back up, it doesn't quite work correctly. This was either a miss or just considered a happy accident at the time.
Everything's nice here.
There is something rather interesting about this particular script though. The way it's structured, it looks like it initially served a different purpose. Rather than spawning dead bodies, it looks like it instead was used to clean them up as you progress. So all those cut bodies in the swamp, if you head down into the facility, then head back out, they'd mysteriously vanish. Knowing what we know now about the Flood, it's definitely an unsettling detail. Next, let's talk about the Bigfoot sightings, those special hidden Flood in the cliffs and trees. With the new adapted cut bodies and far-off fighting, they take a much more center stage as they stalk you throughout the swamp. One thing that always seemed like a mistake was Bungie used Elite Flood instead of Human Flood, despite your radar tagging them as friendlies to reflect what they once were. Swapping these forms to be human instead fits this theme a lot better, and is also a bit more creepy as you progress through, seeing what looks like human figures beyond the fog. My only guess as to why they went with these Elite Flood forms instead is that they are quite a lot more thick, which would show up a lot better on a lower resolution display like a CRT. Oftentimes, a lot of the things that were cut or changed were simply due to technical limitations at the time, and I have to believe this is one of them. Okay, now the final piece of cut content before we finally head inside is the 1749 shotgun and flamethrower. In the beta build, all difficulties had access to the shotgun and flamethrower right from the very start of the mission. In fact, this is the first level where the flamethrower appears organically in the beta. If you didn't know, the flamethrower wasn't always going to be a Halo PC exclusive. There's hints all over the retail build of this weapon's existence, and it wasn't until the 1749 beta that we finally saw its use case as the new weapon for the second half. The shotgun actually took a much more prominent role in the early games, such as on Halo and Truth and Reconciliation. I restored this same theming here, adding a shotgun by the Crash Pelican and a flamethrower by the tree, just like in 1749. I also added some ammo so you can fill up before heading out. I will, however, note that there's only one shotgun and one flamethrower here, so if you have a friend that you're engaging in some
Jolly cooperation,
well, you might have to get a little less jolly as you work out who gets the shotgun and who gets the flamethrower. Just noting for future reference. Heading out of the swamp and into the interior, I once again wanted to better adapt Bungie's other cut floating rifles from the previous video to better fit within the context they would be used in, essentially finishing the concept Bungie was playing with. The first is the cut rifles at the bottom of the lift. If you recall from the prior video, as you go down the lift you'd see some grunts fleeing from the Bay Area with assault rifle fire shooting at them. And in the next room, you'd again see more rifles firing out from an open door at the far end. These rifles on their own definitely feel a bit out of place. When you follow them, they don't actually go anywhere. You see no evidence of their existence, and whatever setup they're hinting at never really manifests. But if we were to combine them with more Bigfoot sightings or perhaps better environment design, they might just wind up fitting the mold a lot better. First, let's look at the rifles at the bottom of the lift. These aren't just floating assault rifles. Well, they are, but that's not what they're supposed to represent. These are supposed to represent Flood attacking the grunts and then fleeing once they sense the chief getting a little too close. Flood fleeing the scene so close to the player presents an excellent opportunity to utilize more of those Bigfoot sightings. So, upon moving into the next area, you'd catch just a glimpse of the culprits behind the glass wall with the door behind them locking shut. A much smoother payoff. Next we have these rifles shooting out of the door to the right. To determine how these fit, we need to look at what goes on in the next room. You'll recall this rather famous hallway with the dead jackal covered in blood and also what looks like a last stand in the small side room. It's clear from this context that the Covenant we would see fleeing were the lucky ones, the ones that got away. So in this veil, upon moving deeper within, you'd see an even more grisly scene, the ones that tried to flee but weren't so lucky. The context given by these two simple additions perfectly fit the floating rifles here. Something is fighting the Covenant, something that doesn't want you to see them, but they are clearly a force to be reckoned with. Makes them fit within the game world. And now for this next scene, what is quite possibly one of the most important moments of the level, the Crazy Marine.
Stay back! Stay back! You're not turning me into one of those things!
I briefly referenced the dev commentary in my last video for what the developers had originally planned here.
Crazy Marine was supposed to stay alive, and then when you walked however many world units away from him, and we checked, to see that you weren't looking, we were just gonna have this big bang, right? And you would come back and you'd be dead on the floor.
I am happy to say that this developer concept has now been fully realized. When you walk far enough away from the Marine, you'd hear a loud bang. And when you walk back, quite clear what happened. And to Marty's original vision, it will only ever happen off screen when you walk far enough away. Behind the scenes, this was actually very simple to put together too. It's just a sound effect that's played on top of the Marine with a command to kill him. So I assure you, this was not cut for technical reasons. The reason it was ultimately cut was likely because this was just a different time. Game came out in 2001 and people's tolerance for this sort of topic in a video game was probably quite a lot lower, and this was an Xbox launch title to boot. Makes sense that maybe they'd want to play it a little more safe. Still, it's a very cool what-if scene, and the whole room is clearly designed around it. It just kinda works, and I do wish they implemented it fully. As a final note about this room, like last time, there's also these unique dead elites with their chests ripped open. They are completely custom made for this level, and I restored them to this section as a stand-in for something special planned after the reveal. And now we move on to the reveal cutscene. Right, so there's this cut grunt that's scripted to flee out of the reveal room when you reach a certain part of the room after activating the light bridge. Nothing particularly special, he just runs to a predetermined spot. Alright, now actually moving on to the reveal, in addition to the bits I covered last time, there's also some additional cut dialogue and even an unused song that was buried within the 1749 beta sound files. So, for the Pelican scene, it's fairly well known that the developers were originally going to have a licensed track.
Remember I wanted you to license an actual song for this? What were we gonna license? Magic Carpet,
Paint It
right?
Black, yeah.
Oh, that's right.
Rolling Stones. Instead, this is an O'Donnell Salvatore original rock and roll something.
This licensed song was reported to be Paint It Black by the Rolling Stones. However, I have it on very good authority that this was not the only song they were considering. I was poking around within the beta sound files, and in doing so, I did find a licensed track, but it was not Paint It Black. Yep, that's right. If you didn't catch that, within the beta sound tags, Bungie had War by Edwin Starr in the X50 cutscene folder, which is the codename for the reveal cutscene. This all rather definitively hints that Bungie was considering multiple licensed tracks at this time, one of them being Paint It Black, and another being War by Edwin Starr. This is such a cool piece of history that, as far as I'm aware, has never really been talked about until now. But it's there, it's real, and it's such a cool thing to have. I went ahead and restored this one in all its glory because there's absolutely no way I was leaving this one buried. Moving on, let's talk about some more cut dialogue, again from 1749. The first is in the lab scene. Mendoza has an extra unused line where he specifically mentions the elite's torn out chests.
Which is weird, right? I mean, look at it. Something tore open its chest and scrambled the inside.
Very subtle, and you probably don't quite hear it right away, so here it is compared to the OG.
Look at it. Something scrambled the insides. Look at it. Something tore open its chest and scrambled the inside.
Not sure why they decided to trim this one, as it still fits within this context. The next is a little more obvious as to why it was cut, which is another unused dialogue line from Keys.
Real pretty. Friend of yours?
No, we just met.
Keep moving.
That last line,
Keep moving.
was ultimately cut from the final game. The question as to why they cut this one is likely because the take was just a little bit too aggressive and out of place. I mean, his prior line is somewhat tongue-in-cheek, saying,
Real pretty. Friend of yours?
No, we just met.
followed by an aggressive,
Keep moving.
definitely seems a little unwarranted. And that's all the new material for the reveal cutscene. Next, I'd like to talk about the return. In the 1749 beta, this reveal room was perhaps the most unfinished. It acted like how it does in retail for the most part, just with a lot of jank, like you actually have to look at the doors before they bust down, which is just confusing if you don't actually know to do that. But there are some interesting cut spawns from 1749 that make a lot of sense to restore here, namely the spawns that appear on the upper level behind the two doors. These doors will work very well as part of the grand reveal when the entrance door is broken down to reveal Flood combat forms. Builds a very nice chaotic scene, one I wish Bungie kept in. Next, let's talk about the post-reveal Crazy Marine room. First, remember those 3 dead elites in the reveal room? Well, you'll recall from the last video that some cut elite Flood forms would rush out of the room into the open bay area. These elite combat forms are rather clearly meant to represent these dead elites reanimated as Flood forms. It's a subtle but interesting thing of note. To that end, those dead elites you see on your first trip through are now gone after the reveal cutscene to finally connect those dots. Which leads us all the way back to the Crazy Marine. I mean, if those elites could be reanimated, why not the Crazy Marine too? And that's the final piece of the puzzle, a fully optional encounter to teach the player another terrifying detail about the Flood. It's not just Covenant they infect, and you don't necessarily need to be alive to be reanimated. And so I scripted together a very special encounter to finally close this loop. If you choose to return to this room, first you'll get some spooky music in the hallway. This is one of my personal favorite ambiance tracks in the game and fits the vibes perfectly. Next, as you get closer inside, you'll hear something a little sinister. Well, there's only one explanation for that, and upon entering the room, you'll see a single human Flood surrounded by infection forms, and that single human Flood is holding a pistol, the very same one used by the Crazy Marine. This is something I always desperately wish Bungie had seen to fruition. It makes so much sense and builds such a good moment. Next up, let's talk about the broken lift. In the base game, this was ultimately left as an optional Easter egg by Bungie. If instead of the door at the far end, you go back the way you came to the entrance lift, well, this whole sequence somewhat confused me on my initial inspection. From a scripting perspective, it seems to be written in a way that would hint at it being required, like you couldn't just skip it like you can in the final game. So I wanted to revisit this particular sequence to understand if that were really true, and if there was any other evidence present that could confirm that this was not going to be optional. And so that investigation first leads us to these Flood combat forms in these tiny little side rooms you walk past on your way back to the bay. These Flood don't actually do anything but stare at you as you make your way back to the bay, but I always found them to be a little too convenient. Turns out we have some unused testing scripts that would break the doors out of their containment. Well, that can't be a coincidence. Were they perhaps supposed to follow the player out into the bay as they walked past? But wait, no, these test scripts don't have a door breaking animation, so it must have happened off screen. So what if instead these Flood were meant to break out after the player activates the broken lift? That would explain the lack of a break animation. Then what if those very Flood happened to, say, run into an unlucky squad of Covenant that just so happened to be in the wrong place at the wrong time? And wouldn't it be very convenient if those Covenant also unlocked that door at the far end? So if all this were true, well, that would mean this bay area would be a lot more empty upon first returning, those Covenant not spawning until after the broken lift. Maybe that's why there were all those cut Flood spawns by the door back to the lift, and maybe that door leading deeper within was actually still locked at this time. This all makes sense. The objective you're given after the reveal is simply titled Escape. That means get the hell out of here as quickly as you can. Quickest way being the horse you rode in on. So maybe that optional broken lift wasn't always so optional. And that's exactly how I believe this was originally going to play out. After activating the lift, a small batch of Flood would pour into the room, forcing you to fight your way out. And upon heading back, you'd see that unlucky squad of Covenant coming face to face with those Flood we saw in containment, also conveniently unlocking that door at the far end, allowing us to progress deeper into the facility. This all flows very naturally given all the hints in the scripting, all the cut enemies, and the way the broken lift actually works in the game's code. It honestly wasn't all that difficult to connect the dots either, almost like they were meant to be connected. I believe the only reason this was cut was to keep players from getting too lost. If you don't know to do this, it's not all that clear. And look, I get it. You're halfway through a comment about how high your IQ is because you knew how to do this. How could the bird guy not know? Well, unfortunately for us stupid folk, the rooms notoriously all look exactly the same. It's very easy to get lost, even if your dream Halloween costume is to dress up like a Halo speedrunner. Okay, so yeah, getting lost is a problem on this level, yeah. My counterpoint though, is I don't think this awesome lift sequence needed to be cut if that were the actual reason. There's actually a very simple solution to keeping players from getting lost in a video game. Watch. And with that out of the way, let's now head down deeper into the facility to find another way out. You might recall from my last video that upon entering this bigger room at the bottom of the lift, there was this cut sequence with these Marines fleeing through the door at the other end, with some Flood chasing them and busting down the door in the process. Not too much is different here. I largely cleaned up the scripting so it flows a lot cleaner, essentially what it would look like if Bungie gave it a polishing pass. This broken door sequence was also present in the beta build, though it didn't exactly work correctly. The Marines were instead the one that broke down the door, then it became locked, and then it just became broken again as the Flood come through. Look, the only reason I'm mentioning 1749 here is because one of the Flood that chases the Marines actually has a flamethrower. This was quite common in the beta, actually. Lots of Flood would spawn wielding flamethrowers throughout the game. These flamethrower variants were also present in the retail build too, just deactivated. I went ahead and reactivated them and other such flamethrower Flood throughout the level. Careful you don't get burned by it. Alright, next up on this floor is another 1749 exclusive that actually hints at a different path the developers would have intended you take. Once you move past the busted door and into the next bay area, you're presented with 3 options for where to go. The intended way is for you to go straight, with the side doors leading to nothing but dead ends. Going the intended way leads you to this rather famous room with the Jackal Marine Last Stand, where you jump up on this broken pillar in order to get to the second floor. Now, one thing I covered in my last video that always fascinated me is the secret broken lift on the second floor of this bay area. This is just simply an unused area that's fully rendered with a broken lift and even a Flood encounter. There's no actual way to get up here in game, however, unless you cheat or use a glitch, which is the same thing according to many of you. So if we can't get up here normally, why does this lift even exist? Did the developers perhaps intend for you to jump up to the second floor in the Jackal room, then backtrack to the bay area? No, I think they had a very different idea in mind, and it's 1749 that finally provided that crucial puzzle piece. Upon entering the bay area in the beta build, if you instead go through this hallway on the right, it's not a dead end. There's a whole nother room complete with a Flood combat encounter. This room on the right does not exist at all in the final game, at least not the geometry. It's fully 1749 exclusive. If we examine this room just a little bit closer, you'll notice it's an exact carbon copy of the room with the Jackal Marine Last Stand, complete with the very pillar you used to get to the second floor. Bungie quite literally cut and pasted this room for the final game. In 1749, the room you'd see upon going straight is a completely different room to retail, without the crash pillar and instead having this really annoying platform you'd have to jump on to get to the second floor. Well, okay, so what's even the point of all this? Well, I believe this optional side room in 1749 was instead going to be the required path to progress to get to the second floor. To prove this theory, I brought this side room back to the final game, and much to my surprise, I actually found unused scenery objects that were left behind from before its removal, such as fire and some dead bodies. In other words, this was clearly where the Jackal Marine Last Stand was originally going to be, in this side room. In addition, when you actually use this broken pillar to get up to the second floor, it leads you directly to the broken lift, which you'd go and explore just to see the Flood already got to it, leaving only one way forward. So you'd enter this bay area and the door straight ahead would instead be locked, forcing you to go through this side room instead. It all flows naturally and feels deliberate when you structure it like this, and it finally explains how and why this broken lift even exists, where it would fit. You were always going to see it originally. As for why they ultimately cut this whole sequence, well, I'm guessing there were quite a few playtesters that got a bit lost in this section, which they probably found pretty embarrassing, huh? I went ahead and fully restored this sequence and made sure to add some extra environment design, like including moving the Jackal Marine Last Stand to this side room so it all fits together naturally. I also fixed this jumping portion, because holy hell, this was annoying. From here, there's nothing else of note until we finally find the lift that takes us back to the surface. At the very top, the 1749 beta had a rather interesting encounter that was ultimately cut from the final game. There'd be a group of Marines fleeing down the ramp from a large bunch of infection infection forms. If you rescue them, there wouldn't be any marine dialogue either, which was somewhat unique here too. I wanted to adapt this encounter to seamlessly integrate with the other dialogue present in the final build. So, as you come up the lift, you'll see those same marines fleeing for their lives, and only after those infection forms are dead will the dialogue play out like in retail.
Sir, thank God you're here. We've been lost out here for hours.
I'm guessing they cut this so the player wouldn't ever unintentionally miss this dialogue by running away or something. But that's not all in this second swamp section. There's also some 1749 Foehammer dialogue that ultimately went unused in the final game. This dialogue seems to hint that the Master Chief was originally going to respond to Foehammer.
What's going on down there? I'm tracking movement all over the place. Negative, Master Chief. I have no visual on you and the swamp's canopy's too thick. I can't see any way through. Wait one... Okay, Chief. There's a large tower a few...
Ultimately, Bungie made the call that Chief should be more silent and stoic, taking on a silent protagonist role.
The drop zone is clear.
Probably for the best. Still, I wanted to adapt this extra Foehammer dialogue somehow, perhaps take the parts that are new and cut off the response portions so it stands on its own like the original. That all leads to this adaptation.
These things, they ambushed us. We gotta get out of here.
I have no visual on you and the swamp's canopy's too thick. I can't see any way through. There's a large tower a few...
Fits well in context. Foehammer informs Chief and crew that she can't pick them up where they are currently and should head for a large tower somewhere outside. Moving on outside, there's nothing new in this second swamp bit beyond the increased spawns and heightened AI aggression I mentioned in my prior video, but that all changes once we get to that final cutscene where we have yet another gold mine of 1749 material. First, we have an unused chapter title when the cutscene starts, New Friends, replacing the 343 Guilty Spark chapter title we'd see in the final build. Then we get a lot of extra exposition from old Sparky.
Unfortunate. Someone has released the Flawed. It will be necessary for us to activate the installation's containment measures. It is the nature of the flood to spread. My function is to prevent it from leaving this installation, but I require your assistance. Come, this way. Someone has released the Flawed. My function is to prevent it from leaving this installation, but I require your assistance. Come, this way.
Definitely very cool to hear. Oh, but I'd be an absolute egghead if I didn't mention what is quite possibly the funniest case of what if we have in this game. So, the voice actor for 343 Guilty Spark was given a script to read for this cutscene. Unbeknownst to all parties involved, that script he was given contained a rather unfortunate typo.
I am the monitor of Installation 04. I am 342 Guilty Spark.
Yes, this is real. No, I'm not kidding. This was the original line he recorded with absolutely no editing whatsoever. Now, with that in mind, I'm going to absolutely ruin the original cutscene for you. Forever. They did not have him re-record this line with a corrected script. They just dubbed in another 3 from a different one of his takes. Listen closely.
Greetings. I am the monitor of Installation 04. I am 343 Guilty Spark.
You can very clearly hear the dub over.
I am 343 Guilty Spark. I am 343 Guilty Spark.
And now that you can't ever unhear that dub, I would like to announce that I do offer amnesia services for $30 a pop payable to my PayPal if you want to forget this whole video ever happened. So yeah, Marty and co simply dubbed over the original take to make damn sure it's 343 Guilty Spark. They really lucked out here too, because the robotic nature of Spark makes the dub possible in that context, since it's literally fine if a robot sounds robotic. There is a world though where they left him as 342 Guilty Spark, and they definitely would have killed him off in that world. But anyway, 342 Guilty Spark is an excellent use case for a fun Easter egg. So, beat this level on Legendary and you get...
I am 342 Guilty Spark.
Never gets old, does it? And that's the full revisit of 343 Guilty Spark, an absolutely incredible level with such a rich history of cut concepts and ideas that simply never were. Now I'd like to talk about some other general restorations with this latest mod update. First is the 1749 Master Chief model. This model, which you've seen over the entire course of this video, is a much greener model compared to the OG. The visor shadow is also a lot less pronounced. Many of you mentioned how much you preferred this model, and honestly in many ways I have to agree. Next is the 1749 medkit model that was actually the model used in the official Halo Combat Evolved manual. It's a much darker square shape with a big red plus on it. Guessing they went with the white variant in retail just because it more easily stands out, especially in darker areas. Next is the 1749 plasma grenade effects. In 1749, a lit plasma grenade generates cool electrical sparks, and the resulting explosion is great greener, taking color elements from a fuel rod explosion. I restored these effects as well, and also fixed whatever the hell this weird lighting effect was. And finally, I reverted the Jason Jones runtime edits to paint a world where those last-minute balance updates never happened. These were edits made during runtime on the original Xbox, essentially a hack fix that only affected single-player campaign missions. Reverting these edits make the pistol do 20% more damage to elite shields, be much more accurate when firing single shots spaced apart, and be much less accurate when holding down the fire button, even sending the bullets off the reticle at times. This revert will reward you for taking careful single-fire shots with the pistol, but be unbelievably punishing if you panic and hold down the fire button. This runtime revert also affects the plasma rifle, making it much more inaccurate overall, both when firing carefully and when holding down the fire button. The plasma rifle is quite literally twice as inaccurate without these runtime edits. But look, let's be honest, it's not like anyone's really using the plasma rifle anyway, so it's whatever if they make a bad gun a lot worse and... Oh no. Yep, yeah, that's fair. Yeah, I do suck. Yeah, that's a fair criticism. I don't know how to do things in general. Okay, yeah, I never considered that, but I could see it being really useful in Lasso. That's, I never considered that use case.